origins and their expansion. So the first thing we have to do is discuss who are the Bantus. The Bantus are a collection of peoples in Africa. There's about 400 to 500 million of them worldwide, depending on how you define them. There's some edge cases, as well as the issue of counting their descendants, many of whom are extensively mixed in the Americas as a result of the slave trade. Common group of ancestors that lived about 5,000 years ago in what's nowadays southeastern Nigeria and northwestern Cameroon. Those are countries that are kind of in Western Africa, right along the Atlantic Ocean. Their languages are, have a lot in common. The most divergent of the Bantu languages are actually about as divergent as the Indo-European languages are from each other, about 5,000 years. But due to a number of spread over spreads, that is, kind of die-offs of older, more divergent Bantu groups and conquests and expansions of more recent Bantu groups, there are actually quite a few similarities between the extant languages that are still around today. They range today all the way from Nigeria and Cameroon, all the way to Tanzania and Kenya in the east, and all the way down to South Africa in the south. So huge, huge range. And there's quite a bit of homogeneity within them too, although there is some heterogeneity as well, as we will discuss later. So who are they? So we've discussed who they are. Now, where did they come from? It's very much an open question. African prehistory, unfortunately, has not been studied as extensively as I myself or many other people would like. And there's some other harder reasons for why it hasn't been done. Some parts of, a lot of parts of Africa are underdeveloped. There's some places that are very interesting that are literal war zones or have active insurgencies. One of the most important places for the Bantus is kind of, southeastern Nigeria and kind of northwestern Cameroon, specifically the Cameroonian highlands that actually have, some importance, do have kind of a low-level insurgency against the Cameroonian government. So as a result, there's been only a handful, I believe 4, studies of any kind done in the area, only one of which, unfortunately, is available in English. The other ones are all in French. So really to study this stuff in detail, you do have to know French, since so many of the Bantu countries, their official language is French, and the governments often promote French over the local Bantu languages, for a variety of reasons, homogenizing their nation states, keeping them, more ingrained in the world market, where, knowledge of the Bantu languages isn't an asset, but knowledge of French is. However, we do have some evidence. Some of it, is in more hospitable areas where archaeological and biological remains are better preserved, most notably Ethiopia, the Gabbero Paleo Lake, as well as some sites in North Africa that end up having surprising implications for the Bantus. There's other things we can do too. There's the linguistic comparative methods. We can look at different languages and we can see the similarities they have in words. And from that, we can combine that with archaeology to kind of get an idea for when these different groups split off from each other. For instance, if the word for iron is different in 2 languages, we know that most likely they split before ironworking was developed. And if we know that the date that ironworking developed, we could actually, use that as kind of a ceiling for how long they could have been related together. And then similarly, if we know that they have the same word for something like sorghum, it's a type of crop that's grown in Africa, we know that they were together at the time that sorghum was being cultivated. We can also look for loan words from other languages and see where they got certain concepts from. The way that the words are, we can look at the roots. Do they necessarily have a root that appears to be from the same language family, or does it appear entirely foreign? Like in English, for instance, we have the word kindergarten, which is a school for kids. Now, it's clearly not of English origin. Kinder and Garten don't mean anything in English, but they do mean something in German, so we can tell that it was originally a German word and adapted into the English language, by kind of the influence of the German educational system in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, that's an unusually well-documented example, but there's very, very similar stuff in countless languages across the world. So we have that. Another thing we have is archaeological records. We can look at pots, we can look at, pits, irrigation channels, footpaths. A lot of that stuff leaves traces a lot of times, especially in areas where there were very, very many people. And we can use those to get an idea for their society, burials, animal hunting grounds, kill zones, battlefields, all those kind of things give us insights on prehistoric societies as well. And lastly, the most revolutionary one is DNA analysis. DNA is the thing that, kind of codes our biology, makes us who we are in a lot of senses. And we can look at kind of the changes within DNA, both those that are random, as well as those that are purposeful. The random changes are like those in the Y chromosome that don't really have much of an effect on how we live or how we die, because if it's too bad, then you just don't have descendants. But kind of minor changes go, and since they're not recombined, we can go and, well, let me rephrase that. So the Y chromosome, it's what a father passes down to all of his sons, and it's not recombined. I mean, there are some weird edge cases, but for the most part, the Y chromosome is passed down father to son with no modifications from the mother. And every once in a while, there will be a mutation in, the father's Y chromosome that he passes down onto one of his sons. And, that son has some kids, and they pass down the Y chromosome that's slightly different from his father's Y chromosome. So, on a short time scale, it's not really detectable in most cases, even though it was for the Romanovs, actually, interestingly enough. But over time periods of thousands, tens of thousands of years, it actually is quite noticeable, since it's guaranteed that there are going to be mutations. And from that, you can kind of create a framework for male migrations, if nothing else. One thing that's very common in prehistory is you would have kind of male lineage groups set themselves up as the lords of one tribe or another. They would have a reproductive advantage, more sons, than the other men who weren't necessarily out within that, golden family, so to say, like Chinggis Khan, or Neil of Nine Hostages is the famous Irish example. So they just wouldn't have as many kids necessarily, and their Y chromosomes would be of lesser frequency than those of kind of the ruling clans. That being said, Y chromosome shouldn't be taken as a kind of answer for everything by any means. You can have cases where Y chromosomes completely take over society, where everyone in that society has the same, male line descendant 1,000 or 2,000 years back. But nonetheless, the autosomal contribution, the ancestral contribution and the rest of the DNA that actually does recombine was actually very, very minor. And that's something that happens quite often in history too. The other kind of non-recombining DNA we have is mitochondrial DNA. It's something that a mother passes down to all of her children. So not just the daughters, but the sons too. It's just the sons don't pass it on to their kids. It's just only the daughters. So that's another way we kind of look at the changes within the mitochondrial DNA. It's a little bit more complicated because there is a lot of evidence that certain mitochondrial DNA haplogroups do have, and a haplogroup is just kind of like a set of, mitochondria that share kind of the same mutations with each other. So they're descended from each other more recently than they are from other, mitochondrial haplogroups. So there is some evidence that certain mitochondria, like of disease resistance, make you more resistant to certain climates, that kind of thing. So there is some selection there. It's not necessarily as useful as the Y chromosome in determining these migrations, but it's still very useful since it doesn't recombine. And lastly, we have the autosomal DNA, the ancestry that does recombine. It's a lot more difficult to calculate. It took like an extra 10, 15 years for scientists to really figure out how to use it reliably. And part of that was just coming up with the technology to make DNA sequencing possible, as well as improving our ability to extract deteriorated DNA from very, very old samples. So this stuff is a lot more recent. A lot of the ancient DNA studies that include the autosomal DNA have really been in the last decade, and specifically the last 7 years when it's really taken off. Right around 2011, 2012, there were some pretty big, substantial advances made, like Johannes Krauss over in Germany. He did a bunch of them. You've got that guy in Sweden, David Reich here in the States. So they've done all sorts of awesome things with science, and we can extract ancient DNA in quite a few cases now. Unfortunately, in Africa, the kind of heat and humidity makes that a lot more difficult than it does in the far north. We actually have, I think, more ancient DNA from Mongolia specifically than we do from the entire continent of Africa. Hopefully that changes in the future. We very, very much want to learn more about Africa, but cold and dry climates definitely help preserve DNA better. So those are the tools we have. We have linguistics, we have ancient DNA, and we have archaeology. For some of the stuff, we actually have historical records too. The Bantu expansion continued into the historical period and is actually ongoing right now. It's not something that ever stopped. So we actually have records going back to Carthaginian times, quite a few colonial records as well, and oral traditions, from various peoples that have recorded their migrations, their defeats, that kind of thing too. So we have history, oral and written, to kind of understand the Bantu expansion. So let's go back to the beginning of all things, the Ice Age. So a lot of the northern world was kind of frozen over in ice. You had tribes fighting each other, and all the peoples of Eurasia, Australia, and soon the Americas were descended from, probably one, maybe a couple, small groups of people, no more than a couple hundred, that crossed the Red Sea into Arabia from East Africa. Now, that particular group of descendants, they eventually contributed a lot of back ancestry to Africans as well. However, Africa, the story was a lot weirder. You had what was called, there was a specific toolkit. It was called the Middle Stone Age toolkit, and it lasted from about 500,000 BC to 50,000 BC in most parts of the world. However, in Africa, parts of it lasted as late as, maybe even 9,000 BC in West Africa, and, perhaps within the last couple thousand years in parts of South Central Africa too. A lot of these prehistoric groups, they were very heavily adapted for specific ecologies. You'd have like one group that would be coastal, another group that would be specialized for jungles, another one that would be specialized for living off the plants and animals of the highlands, and in a lot of cases actually have adaptations for high elevation living. That's something that the Mota people, who, they have about like 50%, the Amotic speaking peoples of kind of Western Ethiopia are actually about like 50%, Mota in ancestry, but they have, and had, even 4,000 years ago, a lot of adaptations for kind of high elevation living. There's all sorts of issues that women in particular run into, getting pregnant, having children at those kind of high altitudes. And it's something that a number of peoples, particularly in Tibet and Peru, and in East Africa as well, eventually evolved for. So you have these kind of specialized small hunter-gatherer groups. They're exploiting very different ecologies, and they find it very difficult to interact with each other. They can fight the other hunter-gatherers, but they can't really take over their land since they don't know how. they don't know what plants to eat. They don't know how to hunt the animals or fish specifically. So you have all these very, very divergent groups, some of whom may have not necessarily been fully human. In Eurasia, we see a similar story as well, where the Denisovans and the Neanderthals actually coexisted with humans for, thousands and thousands of years before our ancestors finally overthrew them. There was some mixing, of course, in Eurasia. Most people in Asia have ancestry from both Neanderthals and Denisovans. People in Europe have ancestry from the Neanderthals. Looks like the Neanderthal ancestry, came specifically from the Middle East, the Levant area. The Denisovans, it's less certain. My personal guess would be what's nowadays kind of Southeast Asia, but that's kind of out of the scope of this particular lecture. So we have these Middle Stone Age groups that, maybe they're human, maybe they're not. There's some DNA evidence that suggests that they were about as divergent from humans as Neanderthals were. However, they would have had even more archaic ancestry. I believe there's a specific allele for saliva that certain West Africans have, and Bantus as well, that apparently diverged from the kind of alleles that people in Eurasia have about 1.2, 1.3 million years ago or so. It's very possible that there were multiple groups of kind of these archaic hominids, for lack of a better description, kind of wandering around, up until after the end of the last ice age. They lasted considerably longer than the hominids of Eurasia, who were, largely wiped out by 30,000 BC, although it's possible that there were some in isolated places like New Guinea and the Solomon Islands that might have lasted until maybe 15,000 BC or so. So anyhow, with the end of the Ice Age, there's a lot of climactic changes in Africa as well. The Sahara Desert, which was a desert back in the Ice Age, starts to green up in a lot of ways. You have the Green Sahara period. You have certain forests retreat in advance in West Africa. So there's all this chaos in these environments. And what happens most likely is that the groups that were most adaptable were the ones that ended up triumphing. You start to see those Middle Stone Age groups in West Africa as they all kind of disappear, and they're replaced by these new groups that had been around and had more advanced stone-making technology. So they had better spears, most likely just better at hunting animals, that kind of thing. And that's the course over all of West Africa and North Africa as well. Now, where it gets... Now, most likely it was several different groups that were doing this. It wasn't like one group that kind of triumphed over the other. There was still very much ecological specialization, even though you do see some kind of regional trends, in the kind of last 10,000 years, maybe 10,000 years ago, where you start to see the spread of ceramics. You have pottery, basically, very, very useful stuff, storing food, storing water, carrying water, that kind of thing. So you see that spread after the destruction of those Middle Stone Age cultures. The other thing that you see, and really it's all around the world, we see it in New Guinea, we see it in China, in India, and Sri Lanka, the Middle East. Domestication of crops. You have African rice, you have sorghum, and you have African millet that are all being cultivated in different river basins in Africa very, very early on. Now, the one that we're most concerned with is sorghum. Sorghum was specifically done kind of in, closer to Nigeria, along the Niger River. And that's where we go when we kind of see what would eventually become the Niger-Congo languages and the Niger-Congo speakers. The Niger-Congo speakers, the Bantus are part of the Niger-Congoids, and the Bantu languages are part of the Niger-Congo language family. And what it looks like is, this family, with one exception, which is all the way in Sudan, they go and they share a word for sorghum. It shows that they either got the sorghum from each other, or more likely they developed sorghum, and that's what caused their population expansion. So, and this is something that's seen all over the world. You have even though the crops aren't necessarily, and when I say not necessarily, they weren't at all nearly as good as the crops we have today in terms of nutrition, caloric value, all of that stuff. It still gave them an advantage over the hunter-gatherers in the sense that there were areas like river valleys where you could have, somewhat be able to predict the weather, predict the climate, uh, you know, get a reliable food source that you could cultivate that would enable you to feed your people. And with that kind of reliable food source, rather than having to fight over the highly contested, herds of animals going through and collecting the same plants in the, forests or in the fields, you just have this reliable food source if you just manage to defend one specific area. So this is kind of the dawn of civilization, not just in Africa, but the rest of the world as well, for those areas that develop the farming. There's a massive population expansion, and they kind of go and they spread throughout the areas of West Africa that they can. Now, to the east, they're kind of constricted. There's an area, it's called the Mambilla Escarpment, and it's this plateau, leads into the Cameroonian highlands. And in those highlands, they actually, very different environment, much higher up. The Bantus probably, and others probably could have climbed up there. But the locals, who we do have some DNA from, it's the Shumlaka DNA samples, and I think they're from 2000 BC, if I remember correctly. They go and they show that they're entirely different from the Bantus in their ancestry. They're, quite divergent, split off maybe 100,000 years before them. So there had been some interactions, in Africa within, kind of the last ice age between 150 and 10,000 years ago. However, it didn't totally mix all those differences away. This particular group, they also bore a very unique haplogroup that is still here around today. It's the A00 haplogroup. And its existence kind of came as a surprise to everyone. People were talking about the Y chromosomal Adam who lived maybe 60, 70,000 years ago. And the A00 haplogroup split off between 230 and 270,000 years ago. Very, very, long before, what we would consider humans to necessarily descend from. So there's definitely kind of like a larger human community that existed, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and it kind of got winnowed down gradually to our ancestors. But in Africa, it wasn't winnowed down as much, and you still had these kind of surviving groups that, had these unique lineages and unique ancestry. Still very disputed. We very much need, more archaeology, more DNA, all of that to kind of really get their story. It's possible that some of those archaic groups that we discussed earlier that had been, disappeared with their Middle Stone Age technology, that they might have mixed in or even conquered the more advanced Stone Age people, absorbed into their larger populations, but perhaps they could have taken over, with their strength, height, or whatever. Some of these hominids were definitely stronger and taller than humans, or not necessarily taller, but possibly. We can discuss that too. A lot of unknowns for sure. So anyhow, this ancient lineage survived in this Shumlaka group that was to the east of the Bantus. So there's a lot of kind of convulsions going on in the whole world. The Middle East, of course, most notably the Fertile Crescent, very much not exaggerated. It was a huge phenomenon. And it actually sent kind of two major waves in the Neolithic. And the Neolithic is when you're still using stone tools, but you don't have, kind of metalworking, copper, iron, any of that stuff. But you still have, civilization, certain animals like goats, that kind of thing. So one of those waves, it goes into Europe, becomes the early European farmers. The other one, kind of spreads into North Africa via the African route. And it looks like it spread into kind of the Green Sahara region as well. In Morocco, there's we actually have, some samples from, I believe, 7,000 BC, 6,000 BC, 3,800 BC, and 3,000 BC. And what it shows is that between 6,000 and, or actually, I'm sorry, between 5,000 and 3,800 BC, there's actually a substantial migration of people from the Middle East and Europe. And this is before the Indo-Europeans. This isn't like, white Europeans who are doing this migration. It's a, group more related to modern Sardinians. They go and they migrate into West Africa, and they mix in with this group that had been there for a long, long time, probably, at least 20,000 years. And, they replace about half the population there. And once they do that, they, with their new cultural toolkit, for whatever their synthetic culture was, they go and they expand through the Green Sahara, and they kind of bring that mix with them. So their mix, they had like 50% of that Middle Eastern farmer stuff, both from the northern route through Europe and southern route through Egypt. And they had 50% of this ancestry from this group that doesn't really exist anymore, but the ancestry is found both in that mysterious Ibero-Moravian group that was living up in Morocco and North Africa, and you also see it in the sub-Saharan African groups like the Bantus, the Yoruba, all of those peoples. So it looks like there was some sort of trans-Saharan group that doesn't really exist anymore, but they were kind of roving across the desert. Who that group was, well, there are some suggestions. There's a place called the Gabbero Paleo Lake, which I briefly mentioned earlier. And it's this lake that was actually active at several points during the Green Sahara period. The Green Sahara, a lot more complicated than that. There were certain periods when it dried up and then, turned green again. Won't get too much in detail over those. But there were actually, the first period you actually have these very, very tall people. They were like 2 meters tall. And, or maybe there's the second period. I can't remember. But one of them, they're both before the Middle Eastern people arrived, though. But one of those group of people, extremely tall, they were like 2 meters tall, most likely evolved to do kind of endurance hunting where they would chase after animals for very, very long periods of time. Eventually, just when the animal got tired, they would go and butcher it with their, stone knives and whatnot. So it's possible that particular group in the, Gabbero Paleo Lake area, is this mysterious, group that contributed ancestry to both the sub-Saharan Africans as well as the North Africans. So anyhow, they go, they eventually die off at some point. So they would have been the first group, I think, and they died off maybe 6,000 BC, at least at the Gabbero Paleo Lake area. And the second group you have is, that group that's kind of the mix between those two groups of the Middle Eastern farmers and that, mysterious Green Saharan group. So they go and settle the area before they go and kind of pass on as well. There's one specific group, and it's kind of in Sudan, Chad, that area. And they actually have about 30% of their ancestry from, kind of the Middle Eastern farmers. They're still there. And it looks like they actually reached much, much further down. There's a people called the Lao people in southern Chad. And there's only like 2 or 3 villages of them. But they go, and I think they have about 5% of their ancestry is from these Middle Eastern groups. So these Middle Eastern groups, were pushing very, very far. They pushed into India, into the east. They pushed deep into Europe, and they pushed pretty far down into Africa as well, prior to the Green Sahara drying up on them between 4,000 and 2,000 BC. So the drying up of the Green Sahara, you have all these, presumably there were whole civilizations, particularly on the Yellow Nile. The Yellow Nile actually used to flow from the west in the Aïr Mountains all the way, into Sudan, and then, of course, up through Sudan into Egypt. It's completely dry now. It's called the Wadi Hawar, but from what we know, there were at least one fortress that was pretty sizable. It was built there around, I think, 1000 BC. So definitely some scary people that worried the locals in Sudan enough to build a giant fortress to keep them away. So what all these have to do with the Bantu? So some of these groups most likely did come in contact with the Bantu right at the very end. They're reaching pretty far south. They go, and by the Sahara drying, that kind of ends their expansion south. And the Bantus kind of have their moment of opportunity. They have, so around 3000 BC, they go and they have pretty decent, long-standing agricultural society based around sorghum. They had goats too, which they'd gotten from the East Africans that had spread across, what was then the Sahel, which actually used to be a lot nicer then than it was now. They had, what else did they have? Sorry, I'm just checking my notes. So they had goats. They did not have cattle yet by that point. And let's see. They were still hunting and fishing quite a bit. They hunted bush pigs, spotted hyenas, marsh antelope, black rhinoceri, warthogs, lions. Very much the alpha predators who kind of attacked a lot of these wild animals and hunted them for food, or conversely were hunted. At that point in their lives, they really didn't have the ability to contest with the elephants. The elephants could easily go and destroy like an entire village by going and eating all of their crops in a day, or just trampling on them. So the wildlife in Africa was much, much better adapted to dealing with humans than the wildlife was in the rest of the world. I don't think Africans actually got kind of the advantage over the elephants until the last 200 years or so, with the more widespread introduction of weapons. So we're at 3000 BC, and that's when we have our kind of Great Bantu expansion. So this group that we mentioned, the Shumlaka people, they get entirely overrun, or at least outside of the highlands. Most likely, it looks like they probably inhabited, the rivers and jungles too, but the Bantu just kind of swarmed them out with their superior numbers. Africa used to be a lot more diverse prior to the Bantu expansion. There were a lot of these pygmy groups that had evolved to live in the jungles, and they were gradually displaced as time went on. So the Bantus, they kind of have three main divisions. You have the southwestern Bantus, you have the west central Bantus, and you have the eastern Bantus. And the eastern Bantus are kind of the most important one. So kind of the first groups of the Bantus, they press down from Cameroon into Gabon and the Congo, and they're very limited in their kind of ecology. They are limited to kind of just river valleys specifically. They spread on the inner Congo, all the way up until the 4th century BC, really. And they don't really press that deep into, the jungle or anything. The southwestern Bantus, they actually reached the, I'm going to mispronounce it, it's the Agua River. And the Agua River, that's in Gabon. They reached that by 2000 BC. So it takes them 1,000 years to kind of get into Gabon. And Gabon's a country just to the southwest of Cameroon. So they're kind of, pressing along the coast as well. The eastern Bantus, they kind of do the migration rather than through the river valleys and the jungles of Central Africa. They instead push, through the northern savannas, and they come in contact with another Niger-Congo group, so another group that's kind of yam farmers, sorghum farmers, whatnot, called the Adamwa Ubangis. And the Adamwa Ubangis, lots unknown about them. I haven't been able to find out too many details. I think a lot of it has to do with the Central African Republic being in some long-standing civil war. So no one really, I think there was one French guy, who went and checked it out. And then you have, the government of Cameroon actually, has a guy at their university, who wrote a book on them, but unfortunately it's in French. Very, very interesting people. I'm sure there's a lot more to learn about the Adamwa Ubangis. But the Adama Ubangis, they were part of, the trade networks that connected all the way up to Egypt, along with the people who become extremely important in the history of the East Bantus, as well as all the Bantus, the Central Sudanics. And the Central Sudanics, despite their name, actually kind of lived in Western Sudan originally. They were most likely a group of people who lived in the Yellow Nile basin. The Yellow Nile was, kind of like west to east tributary of the Nile. It went from the Air Mountains, into the Sudan before it, kind of flowed into the main Nile, which goes up through Egypt and eventually flows to the Mediterranean. So they're much, closer to the Middle Eastern groups that are spreading a lot of different technologies. And, they're the ones that, kind of introduce ironworking to the East Bantus. The Central Sudanics, their particular home in kind of Western Sudan, or really southwestern Sudan, is kind of interesting in that, it's called ironstone. They have this soil that's very, very poor for agriculture, but it actually has a very high iron content. So they had kind of a whole mode of production based around where they would separate out the iron ores from the soil and go and smelt it. And that was, probably like 1000 BC that they got that iron, and they introduced it to the Eastern Bantus, who had kind of crossed the savannas, just south of, between the Sahara to the north and the jungles to the south, and had reached the African Great Lakes, kind of, like Western Tanzania, Western Kenya, right around Rwanda and Burundi, that whole area. So they spread ironworking to the Bantus between maybe about 400 BC to 500 AD. Now, at the same time, you have another group called the Kushites, who are spreading at the same time. The Middle Eastern farmers, they had been pressing to the south into Arabia, into Somalia, and into Ethiopia at the same time that the Bantus had been spreading from their original homeland in kind of eastern Nigeria and western Cameroon. One of these groups is called the Kushites. They arrived in East Africa at some point before the Semites. The Semites arrived around the time of the Bronze Age collapse between 1200 and 800 BC. There was a massive kind of famine, drought, that kind of thing. So those kind of Moda people that were living up in the highlands lost out to these new Semitic conquerors. At some point before that, the Kushites had arrived. They mixed in with the locals pretty extensively. But you can still, like, just looking at, Somalis, for instance, are very famous Cushitic people. You can tell just from looking at them that they're, they definitely have a lot of Middle Eastern ancestry within them. And they don't look, anything like kind of the Bantus or West African peoples. So the Kushites actually were pushing to the south along the coast. They had contacts with the Middle East fairly extensively. They also had contacts with India too. There's a whole kind of trading world, between Somalia, India, Oman, Yemen, and then the Yemenis had their camel caravan routes that ran up to the Levant and Mesopotamia. The Queen of Sheba, actually, I believe, is I'm not sure if she was a Kushite or if she was actually, she was probably a Semite, given that she was dealing with Hebrews. It wasn't too difficult for them to understand each other. By that point, I think, the Semitic languages of East Africa would have been about as related to kind of the Hebrew that, King David and King Solomon spoke, as Portuguese is from Romanians. There would have been a lot of mutual intelligibility, and it wouldn't have been too difficult for them to learn each other's languages. Because I believe the Semitic proto-language was about 3000 BC, so it would have only been about 2000 years by that time. So anyhow, the Kushites, they're connected with, kind of the broader Middle Eastern world. They have those particular technologies. But nonetheless, they're not really able to exploit the soils that well, and they kind of remain a pastoral people. And they're not able to really build up their population that much. So what happens is you have the, kind of plague of Cyprian, plague of Justinian. They go, I think they originally come from Asia, kind of spreads all over the world, devastates everyone, the ancestors of the Japanese invade Japan, the Roman Empire, is crumbling. Justinian's unable to restore order. All sorts of stuff going on. That affected Africa too. The Bantus who had expanded into the Congo Basin, even though they had metalworking by that point, they had adopted it from the Central Sudanic peoples. They still hadn't. There were still a lot of like pygmy groups. The Kushites were still around in the east, and they only really controlled the river valleys. But they were part of the trade networks that connected to the Mediterranean. The kind of realm of Meroe, and I know I'm mispronouncing that, is kind of in like southern Egypt, northern Sudan. Another group with extensive genetic and cultural and technological contacts with the Middle East. They were connected to kind of sub-Saharan Africa pretty deeply. Ivory was a major import of theirs, where they'd send it up to the Mediterranean world. And in the south, they'd send, more sophisticated metalwork. And one of the things that came with trade and contacts and mixing was disease. So these plagues, plague of Cyprian, and most importantly, the plague of Justinian, went and devastated the Bantu world between, probably like 500 and 600 BC. Same time as devastating the rest of the world too. It took about 500 years for the Bantus to kind of really recover from those plagues. Whatever kind of like state structures they had were disrupted. You had, other groups like the Central Sudanics, that group I mentioned from kind of southwestern Sudan. They launched their own kind of invasion of the northwest Congo too. There's actually one pygmy group that bizarrely speaks a, Western Sudanic language, which is very interesting. Because a lot of the, when these peoples would come in contact with the pygmies, were basically treated as slaves in a lot of ways. They were, they had uses for the conquerors in the sense they knew how to, go into the jungle. They could find useful foods. They had a lot of expertise and adaptations. But at the same time, the pygmies were very, very reliant on their conquerors for kind of all those calories that they got from, those more carbohydrate-rich crops. So, you end up developing, this mutualistic society, and there's a lot of mixing. And mixing is kind of a, bad word to use because basically they were just being slaves that were horribly, horribly treated and still are, even to the present. Pygmy slavery is very much a problem. But a lot of pygmies, they do have a lot of Bantu ancestry from the mixing, and the Bantus really don't have that much pygmy ancestry. I think it peaks out at like 15% in some groups, but in most parts it's far, far less than that. The East Bantus in particular were pretty xenophobic. They didn't really like mixing with anyone. The East Bantus in Kenya, the Luhlia, I know I'm mispronouncing that. I can't speak any of the Bantu languages, and I'm not familiar with their phonology. They actually have no non-Bantu language or ancestry at all. They just kind of showed up and killed everyone and didn't mix with them. And there's a couple million of them. Their contacts weren't necessarily the pygmies, though, but kind of that savanna route looks like was particularly conflict-ridden. When they adopted kind of that lifestyle of cattle herding and whatnot from the Central Sudanics, they kind of ended their, mixing after that. So when the Eastern Bantus, they go and they arrive in the Great Lakes, around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, early Middle Ages to Charlemagne's time, and they come in contact with these Cushitic peoples, of whom the Iroquois, that's I-R-A-Q-W, I know I'm mispronouncing that, are kind of the last survivors. And the Iroquois, they only survive because their particular home is very defensible. They've got like mountains and lakes ringing them in on every side. Makes it very, very difficult for anyone to kind of take them over. So anyhow, they go, their better agricultural techniques enable their population to grow a lot faster than that of the Southern Kushites, and they were able to, push the Southern Kushites into a very, very marginal position, largely destroying them. It's a little bit more, So even though the Kushites were kind of defeated, the Nilo-Saharan peoples, like the ancestors, the Maasai, were a lot more capable. Very professional cattle herders, uh, fierce warriors, that kind of thing. And as the Bantus in kind of the Great Lakes region settled down, even though they initially had kind of the Nilo-Saharans, as their servitors and whatnot, some of those Nilo-Saharan groups ended up becoming quite powerful towards the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of the early modern period, maybe like 15th to 17th centuries. So a couple of these kind of like defeated groups, the Southern Kushites, the Nilo-Saharan groups that were in the Great Lakes, they go and they eventually kind of meld together into a new people. And those people are what we know today as the Tutsis. They're only about like a third Bantu in ancestry, and the other 2/3 of their ancestry comes from kind of the collection of the other peoples who were defeated by the Bantus, in the Middle Ages. So, and that's actually very important. The Hutus are extremely well aware of this. They're actually explicit, justification for their attempted annihilation of the Tutsis in the 1990s and in the 1960s was due to the Tutsis not being Bantu in origin. Now, the current government of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, his guys, even though they're Tutsis, they strongly insist, oh, everyone's Rwandan and we're all from the Great Lakes. That's not actually true. The guys who, like Hariyamba, the other, or not Hariyamba, the guys who killed Hariyamba, those people, the Interamwe, those guys, the Hutus, they're actually quite right that the origins of the Tutsis are to the north, specifically to, Somalia. I think they attribute it to Ethiopia, but and it kind of like blends in with Ethiopia. So there are Cushitic peoples in Ethiopia, but I think most likely their ancestors were from, the Somalia area. At least some of them. They do have considerable amount of Bantu ancestry as well. So that's kind of like the origins of the, kind of Hutu-Tutsi conflict in the Great Lakes. It goes back over 1,000 years. So very, very interesting stuff. So the Bantus, after about 1000 AD, they kind of recover from the plagues of Justinian, start to develop their, more advanced social structures, improving their iron working, which gets a lot better. And they, spread further and further south. Some groups had actually reached South Africa by the 6th century AD, and there's kind of a couple more migrations. Like the East Bantus, they kind of have this giant crescent where they, cross from, or their migrations are kind of a giant crescent where they cross over the savannas between the jungles and to the south and the Sahara to the north. They reach the Great Lakes, go around, kind of down into Mozambique and East Africa, or Eastern South Africa finally. So that's kind of their broad arc. The East Bantus are the ones that, did a lot of the innovations, had the contacts with the Sudanics, with, India, the Middle East. So they're the ones that kind of spread a lot of these technologies to the other Bantu groups. And by spread, I mean a lot of this was them just overrunning the other Bantu groups and, destroying them or assimilating them. So, after iron was invented, the Bantus, they go and they kind of get their advantage over the Pygmies had actually substantially increased. That was what kind of enabled them to go deeper into the jungle, and take over a lot of these Pygmy groups. In areas like the deserts, southwestern Zambia, Namibia and Botswana, as well as kind of the veldt of the northern part of South Africa, the Bantu ironworking, cattle driving, their crops didn't necessarily have the same advantage over the Khoisan people, who were very, very distinct, not just from the Pygmies and the Kushites and the Bantus, but also from each other. The Khoisans, it's kind of a catch-all term for a bunch of very, very divergent groups, who split off more than 100,000 years ago from each other, as well as, the rest of mankind. They had all sorts of ingenious stuff. They, had like poisoned arrows they would use to fight the Bantus. And they weren't really defeated until the Afrikaners, that kind of mixed group of French, Dutch, and Malays. The average Afrikaner is only like 90% European in ancestry. The rest of their ancestry, it's Indian, Filipino, Indonesian, Malay, with a little bit of Khoisan and Bantu mixed in. So the Afrikaners finally snuffed them out in the 19th century, with all the weapons that they're importing from Europe. The Afrikaners go and end up being pretty fierce enemies of the Bantu groups in South Africa. So the Bantus, they go, and there's this, you have Shaka Zulu and the Zulus, who are a Bantu group in South Africa. They go and they develop kind of this new military organizational method that enables them to just kind of constantly destroy a lot of their enemies. And, kind of like the Huns, when the Huns showed up or the Mongols showed up, and they sent kind of this chain reaction of peoples wandering. The arrival of the Zulus and kind of the rise of Shaka Zulu did much the same thing in Africa. It sent, peoples fleeing all the way north into, as far north as Zambia, so hundreds and hundreds of kilometers. And some of these groups actually went and they would destroy the, other Bantu group that was there, take their women and kind of set themselves up as the new lords of the region. So definitely not a static people by any means. And, a lot of those migrations are still ongoing. You have, in South Africa in particular, you have, a lot of migration from the Igbo, who are Bantoid people, not Bantu. They kind of stayed home and pursued their own path of development. They're taking over a lot of stuff in South Africa. You have ongoing Bantu takeovers of, pygmy groups in the Congo. So Bantu expansion is still very much ongoing. Another thing too, and in South Africa, by the way, the Khoisan contribute very, very little ancestry to any of the Bantu groups there. I think it peaks out at about 5% with the Xhosa. You can kind of see with like Nelson Mandela how he doesn't have that typical Bantu look, so maybe he has a bit more. But overall, the Khoisan did not mix much with the Bantus in South Africa. A couple other things. So, interestingly, I mentioned earlier the A00 haplogroup, how divergent it was, how there were kind of like surviving, groups in, highland areas that some of those at some point did take over Bantu groups, most likely due to their adaptations to, local ecologies. The Imbo people of Western Cameroon and the Cameroonian highlands, I think like 60 or 70% of them have that A00 haplogroup. So that shows that, some of those people, maybe they're related to those, Shumlaka people, maybe not, actually did succeed in defeating the Bantus and taking over their groups. And it looks like that might have taken place in a couple other areas as well. In the question and DM, someone's asking me how much ancestry they contributed to modern Somalis. Last time I checked, I just ran it on the G25. It's about like 5% of the ancestors of modern Somalis or Bantus. Pretty similar for a lot of Ethiopian groups too. So they did kind of penetrate into the area. There's actually like slavery where the East African groups would raid pretty deep into Africa and, enslave mostly Bantus from the Congo and then bring them back to the East. Even though that particular slave trade was pretty substantial, and it does show its impact on the, ancestry of East African groups, it's definitely far from a majority by any means. So, trying to keep it under an hour. Hope you guys all got a lot out of that. Definitely a lot of open questions regarding the Bantus. Hope this was kind of a good summary